Okay, I'm Andrew Cooper. I'm chairing the Corporate Scrutiny panel. Membership of committee, this is, have we got any substitutions here today?
Councillor Akhtar sent apologies.
Okay. Do members of the committee just want to go through and introduce themselves?
Hi, I'm Nathan Paul. I'm Co-op T.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Councillor James Homewood. I'm one of the members of the panel.
Hi, I'm John Taylor, Councillor John Taylor. I'm a member of the panel as well.
Councillor Will Simpson, also a member of the panel.
Philip Chandler, Public Co-op T.
Councillor John Lawson, member of the panel.
Okay. Right. Minutes of the previous meeting. Is there anything that needs to go up under the minutes of the previous meeting? Can we agree them as a record for the people who were there? Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. Any interest that anybody wishes to declare for this meeting? Nope. Next item, admission of the public. Nothing here appears to be anything which would have be of any detriment there, so I propose that we admit the public. Any deputations or petitions? No. Nope. Any public wanting to ask any questions? Doesn't appear to be. No. So, preparations for leaving the EU. I understand David Bundy is not available for this item, but we have your good souls there to deal with that. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Sean Westerby, Kirklees Council Emergency Planning team, and I'm standing in for David and probably Naz today. So we've been asked to bring this paper on the Council's planning for a no-deal Brexit. And that's a key word. I've put no deal in there because that is the information we're getting from government, that local authorities have to plan for a no-deal Brexit as it stands now. And I'm sure most of you will appreciate it's a pretty fluid situation at the moment, but that's our instruction and that's what we're doing. So some of the stuff at 2.1, if I go through some of the stuff that we've done. So we've appointed a lead officer to oversee Brexit preparations, and that's Nas Parker, Service Director for Housing and Economy and Infrastructure. And some of these roles are highlighted at 2.1.2, and it goes through sort of about communication. We've just established a web page that's got three elements to it: one for businesses, a part for businesses, a part for employees or citizens, should I say, not employees, and a part for EU citizens. So it gives information and it signposts you to government sort of information. So that's on our website. We've got a tactical Brexit team in place which involves partners and service areas of the council, and that's been regular meeting since for quite a few months now. I'm not exact timing on that. We have got some Brexit allocated funds. They've gone into council reserves and we'll draw down on those as we need to. We are part of the Local Resilience Forum. In fact, that's probably one of my key roles, is that sort of linking in with West Yorkshire planning and even national planning from that point of view. We are talking to our local providers of services and voluntary organisations about their preparedness. So there's lots of stuff going off at the moment in relation to the council's preparedness for Brexit. I mean, and there's a West, well, it's a national RIA, so there's 9 national leads from a local authority perspective. Tom Reardon from Leeds City Council is our connect into that, and there's regular sort of emails going back and forth. So it's just how we share information. And I think that's it on that aspect. There's a bit of information about no deal consequences. I think some of that were taken from the press. Now, I don't know if the committee's familiar with Yellow Hammer. I mean, it wasn't, when that went public, it wasn't any surprise to the resilience community, because that's the sort of information we've had all the time. And that's the sort of things we are aware of, but I assure you, it is very fluid in relation to the impacts. They've given us the broad areas that they think might be the impacts, but nobody really knows where it's going and what could be the true impacts. So it's a very fluid situation, and we've tried to set ourselves up around a framework that's nimble enough to be able to adjust itself to the pulls and pushes that we might get through Brexit and different outcomes that might come of it. So there's a lot of work going on. It's a bit like the duck on the pond. It looks very calm on top, but I assure you the legs are going like mad underneath to make sure we are prepared and we are ready for any impacts that might come of Brexit. Do you want to talk a bit about the EU?
So I'm Sue Weston, I'm Strategic Lead for Business and Skills, and I'm a member of the local working group that Sean was referring to. So my role in the group is to work with the city region in terms of what our offer is for business support. So we mentioned in the report is the fact that we've created a local group for leaders of business who are coming together with WICA to look at how we can flex and manage our funds to be able to deliver the support that business needs. And David put into the paper in section 2.3 sort of an economic position. So it's probably no surprise to you that some of the data that's in there and some of the information that's in there in terms of the fact that businesses have been stockpiling. So we've seen recently that imports have increased, and it feels like that might be a little bit of a false positive in terms of the fact that businesses have started to stockpile and have been increased use of warehousing. So there's been sort of a short-term boost to the economy, which we're a little bit watchful and mindful of, because we are worried that in terms of having increased stockpiles of goods, that means the businesses have excess stocks, which could result in challenges to them in terms of cash flow. Cash flow is a key issue that we're talking about at the regional level in terms of being able to think about the mechanisms that we can do with our local and influencing national funds to be able to support businesses in cash flow. Another thing that's been coming out is obviously the devaluing of the sterling, which obviously is feeding through to higher import costs. So again, a lot of issues that are pointing towards the fact that cash flow could be a challenge for business. What we're trying to also do is think about what businesses are saying. So we do have quarterly surveys from the Chamber of Commerce. And surprisingly, you know, actually 51% of the businesses are still saying to the Chamber that actually they're feeling like they're confident in being able to handle impacts. But this, as Sean mentioned, it's quite fluid. So this positivity that 51%, it's only just over 50%, that positivity is changing, and we await further details of current surveys. 71% of businesses are considered impacts, which is also quite positive, and 55% of businesses have mapped their customer and supplier base to try and understand that. But there still is a lot of work to do in this area, and as I say, as we're coming closer and closer to that no-deal scenario, clearly business confidence is changing. So 14% of business expect a beneficial impact. So we're seeing quite polar opposites in some of our conversations with business. On a weekly basis, we send through feedback that we're gathering through our SME growth managers and our teams back to the region to influence what's happening. 40% of the businesses are saying it's beneficial, and actually you find that many businesses that we're talking to are seeing positive impacts. It's not just the impact of Brexit, it's looking at the global economy and the changes in that. So we've got an example of a business where they are buying their goods from France. France, as a result of a downturn in the China market, and the economy in China, their cost of their imports has reduced, which has impacted positively on our business in Kirklees, which means that the cost of their goods has reduced, which has meant that their business is booming now in terms of export to America. So it's a very fluid environment, and there are positives, but clearly there's significant challenges for businesses in Kirklees. We tried to list some of the potential positives that could occur on page 5 in item 2.3.2. You know, the fact that if the decline in the pound could result in it being better to invest in England, maybe there's positives there. The fact that fluctuations in the pound can make our goods and services more profitable. But as I say, when I turn over to the next page, there are significant issues, and those generally relate to the fact that cash flow will be impacted upon. So it's still within section 2.3.2, but it's on page 6. You can see there in the second paragraph, manufacturing are relying on like long-term investment and planning to ensure they remain competitive. And clearly what some of our manufacturers have done is they have thought about getting forward provisions in place ahead of exiting the EU, which clearly, if they can't get rid of those excess stocks, impacts on sort of their cash flow. Similarly, and I think I've touched on this actually, I'm probably repeating myself, higher import costs plus the increase in terms of warehousing also impacts. Not sure whether, hot off the press today, there's been an article in the Times, I don't know whether anybody's read it, from the British Chambers of Commerce, who are sort of raising a call about the lack of complete and sufficient information for businesses planning for a no deal. And they've got a list of unanswered questions that they're calling for government to give a response on. They relate to staff transfers from EU into the UK, customs tariffs, legal implications of trading, data processing, health and safety, and of course EU funding, which we're heavily reliant upon. Because we, as a team, want to get a clearer picture. This isn't contained in this report, but because we wanted to get a clearer picture on the impact on the local economy and think about how we can optimise the performance of the district and get really underneath what the impact is for Kirklees, we're looking to commission some specific research using the local Brexit funds to get as much more on the front foot in terms of understanding the economic impacts. So we're commissioning that report, and it'd be great to get your input on what sort of questions and information you might wish us to commission. I mean, I could give you a brief synopsis if we had time, but of what we're aiming to try and get in terms of that commission.
How would that take?
Sorry, that.
You say it's brief.
Oh yeah, I can tell you the expected outputs from the report.
Right.
Is that all right? Yeah, cool. So basically looking for latest Brexit contexts and scenarios, assessment of business confidence. They'll be using available research, won't be duplicating research. Current strategic and economic position of Kirklees in terms of its employment and labour supply and subsector analyses. The impact of Brexit on trade, the impact of Brexit on regulation, investment, migration, looking at international and national supply chains, an assessment of the current extent to which our current strategies and policies will mitigate, support and the emerging risks and opportunities. And finally, just an overall assessment of the impact, RAG status, so that our local group can look at those challenges. So we're going to commission that as a matter of urgency, but it was an opportunity for you to inform that commission today.
Thank you. So, rules for this debate. This is about Brexit, but don't replay Brexit. Let's not. Let's talk about how this affects Kirklees. Let's go through those issues there. Who's first? to you.
Hello, Philip Challoner. I just wanted to know, have you decided on who you're commissioning, or are you using an academic source or a commercial source?
No, we haven't made any decisions on that. I'll be working with our procurement team to look at our research framework. I understand we have a procurement research framework, and of course it does depend on working with teams in terms of identifying the value of the contract, the commission that this will be, but no, that's not been decided yet.
A couple of comments first. Just on the very first page in the summary 1.2, the details out of date talks about defeated a number of key votes in the last week. Well, clearly it wasn't in the last week. So, you know, if we're going to produce reports, we need to be accurate. Similarly, on 2.1.4, it talks about Operation Yellowhammer and the impact of no deal exit. I think it's been quite clear since our Sunday Times article was released that the government has, you know, sort of stated that that was the, I can't remember the terminology they used, but it was the expected worst outcome, not the expected outcome. So I think it's unfortunate the council is quoting in an official report information that's predicting the worst likely outcome rather than the impact of a no deal exit. So I'm disappointed to see that you've fallen into that trap. So we shouldn't be doing that. You know, this has got to be completely unbiased, and it's just got to be stating the facts as we know the facts. So I'm a little concerned about that. What I'm pleased to hear is the report or the survey that you're commissioning, because when you spoke a little earlier and you're talking about you were getting quarterly surveys, I was starting to think, well, that's not frequent enough at the moment. Although I am a little worried if we're going through a procurement process, we could have got to the end of October before we've got through the procurement process and actually commissioned the report. So you may have to work hard to perhaps push that through at a pace, really, because we need that information in the next couple of weeks, really, don't we, rather than towards the end of October. But thank you for that.
Okay, we'll go to Councillor Lawson, then Councillor Simpson. Just a quick thing here about in terms of bias and things. It's so easy in this for anybody presenting facts to regard them as being biased. So I think we've just got to be really quite careful about that, because anybody who has a penny opinion about this whatsoever will regard it as being biased. So, Councillor Lawson.
Thank you, Chair. With that in mind, I'll keep my comments restricted to the report. Thank you. Thank you. On page 4 of 8, and we're back to the possible medical consequences. We mentioned them. Have we looked into the effects of, or have our partners briefed us on the effects of our departure from Euratom and the effects on oncology services?
The NHS have a work stream that's looking solely at the impacts of Brexit. We're just a user of their services, and the assurance we're getting is they're dealing with the medical aspects. So I can't answer your question directly, but we're getting assurance from the NHS that they're looking at all the impacts, and that's as much information as we've got. We are linked into the NHS planning, but we're not stepping into their world, because we just need assurance from them that the different aspects, whether it's drug supply or other aspects, that continuity will continue. And the information we're getting at this moment in time is that it will continue. So I know I haven't really answered your question, but it is very fluid, and we can only go on what information we've been given.
I was really just looking to the extent of our knowledge on that, and that's the extent of our knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
I'll be very sort of brief. I was going to say more, but then you interjected about John's comments on Yellowhammer. It was my understanding, a lot was said about Yellowhammer, because at first the government responded by saying it was an out-of-date document, and then it turned out it was, 2 or 3 weeks old. I believe it's the reasonable worst-case scenario. So it's something that could conceivably happen. So I think it was a slightly unfair comment, John, with respect. Things have changed now because more preparation has taken place, so it will be out of date by now, but I think we should take it into consideration.
You shouldn't say that's the outcome if it's a worst case outcome.
It's a possible outcome, though, and it should be taken into consideration.
We're veering, we're doing it. It's can we?
You don't quote it as the outcome.
This is a great conversation to have outside.
Yeah, but with regard to the work that's going to be commissioned, so the Bank of England have downgraded their expectations that we'll only lose 5% of the GDP and will only peak inflation at 5.25%, which is still worse than how things peaked in 2008-9. So will we get some kind of forecast on the effect that will have for Kirklees on sort of our business rates, and you've mentioned employment, but so will that form part of that report as well? Will we get an idea of the likely effects of that level using the Bank of England's baseline sort of assumptions?
With your input now, I'll make sure it's added to the list. Clearly, what I have to do is, because many local authorities may be commissioning similar reports, it's subject to expertise. But yeah, I'll make a note of that to add it, because it's a great point to raise in terms of the impact. I mean, the commission is meant to look at impacts in terms of GDP and business rates. But yeah, I'll make a note to ensure that's there. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I think it says at the beginning of the report that obviously things are moving quite quickly and factor changes, so it's quite difficult, I think, to be 100% up to date unless you'd reviewed it on the morning before we talked it through. I did think there were some things actually in there probably more important that are now out of date. So I think one of them, for example, was that the government said previously that freedom of movement would end on the 31st of October. I now believe they've said, well, that's not going to happen. And that is quite a big deal, because it's going to have a big impact. I think it mentions in the report around some of the skills that we need. So that potentially is a big change there. And on Yellowhammer, just a technical point rather than a political one, I suppose. I think that's out of date as well, isn't it now? Because actually it's not a leaked confidential document anymore, it's a public document. And I think that actually there was more information, quite possibly in the document that was fully released, because it was the full document allegedly. So I think we do have to take that seriously. I had just a few questions which I'll go together now in one go if you want, and then you can answer them. So I think it was just around, firstly, on the impact on businesses, because I didn't really pick it up in the report, but you did mention it as you went through, just around the impact of tariffs in a no-deal scenario, because I can see how there are certain things in relation to no-deal Brexit that businesses can plan for. We've all seen these campaigns at the moment about telling freight drivers and things to make sure they have the right documentation in place for the dates after, and those types of things that they can do and understanding the supply chains, etc. But I would imagine what you can't do in the next month is, if you're a business that is fully dependent on trading, either importing, exporting or both with the EU, you aren't suddenly going to be in a month be able to deal with tariffs. And I know that stockpiling is happening in some respects, but I'm not quite sure how any sort of length of planning can impact that, can resolve that in the short term. And linked to that, I heard what you said about the stockpiling and that potentially having a kind of inaccurate positive reflection on economic output. I mean, last quarter, if I understood it right, the UK economy actually contracted. So if that's a kind of false positive, that's a bit of a concern, I would have thought, for the economy. And then the other thing that I just wanted to ask about was, in the report you talk about food supplies, and you referred to obviously schools, hospitals, social services and food banks in terms of what support the council would give. On a wider basis, what is the council's responsibility here if we do have issues with food shortages and people's inability to actually buy foods because of price rises? does the council have a responsibility there? I mean, how, you know, what would, or is that the regional governmental responsibility? You know, how are we going to deal with that inability for some of our vulnerable residents to actually have the food that they need? I'm not quite sure whether that's something that we're looking at all. Thank you.
It's probably two different people answering this question.
Yeah, so thank you for the comments on tariffs. It is, it's a little bit of a fog in terms of what the impact is going to have on business. I probably phrased the false positive I was talking about data I'd seen in relation to the rise in imports in the last quarter. And really, apologies, it's probably my phrasing that was incorrect there. Clearly, we support, like the Chamber, in terms of wanting to seek that clarity, and tariffs is one of the major questions that they've set out in a paper. I can circulate the key questions still to be answered if it's helpful to you all to see that. Similarly, I can give you the latest regional Brexit and economic growth update, and ensure that you're kept up to speed with that. We can get a mechanism so that you're getting that latest data, quarterly data report for that. The monthly meeting that we have with regional officers, clearly we'll be looking at different mechanisms. Like I was saying, VAT holidays, financial support packages, vouchers to help people implement measures to try and keep people sort of fluid and resilient. There's not really very much else I can say about that. In terms of the accuracy of the report, we can ensure that Kate and David, who prepared the report, will feed that back. You'll appreciate the reports are prepared different deadlines, a week in or longer in advance. So apologies for some of the inaccuracies, but David and ourselves will do our best to make sure that doesn't happen in the future.
So if I try and answer as best I can the question about food, from my emergency planning point of view, the work we're doing is about making sure or asking questions about our supply chain, about can we get the food we need to deliver key services for the council, so schools, adult services, health to a certain degree, but that's their work stream, not the council's. So that piece of work is going ahead. There is another dimension to it, which you alluded to, is food inflation and what will the impacts of that be. And I haven't got an answer to that, but we are working with food banks to try and sort of like assess their resilience and understand what groups they look after. Could they sort of like cope with extra demand? Will they need any help around that cope? So the council is there as a support mechanism, but some of it is until we're trying to anticipate what might happen. And as I'm sure you'd appreciate, and it's very difficult. All we can try and do is engage with organisations that can help and support, and try and anticipate and assess any help or need they might need at that time.
Thank you. Councillor
Thank you, Chair. Sue, and I've pretty much shown somewhere I was going to say. Going back to the report, at the time of writing, this report was accurate. Unfortunately, these have to be published in advance, and this is a point that James wrote, so at the time of writing it was accurate, but this is a moving feast that moves so fast that if we wrote something this morning, it could be out of date by this evening. So I don't accept criticism of the report. Obviously did a fantastic job pulling this together, because it changes daily, hourly. There's probably things happening now that we don't know about. So I think it's a bit unfair, and we had to put, whether you like Yellowhammer or not, we had to put that in, because it would be remiss of us as a council, and I'm the political lead on Brexit, it would be remiss of me and the officers who are working on those not to work from the worst case scenario and work backwards in effect. Because if anything goes badly wrong and we haven't spotted it, we are abdicating our responsibilities in some ways. We have to look at the worst case scenarios and take all those into account. And some of those worst case scenarios probably aren't we haven't spotted yet because we don't know, because there's so many unknowns that will come down the track. But as I said, it will be remiss of us and morally wrong not to work from a worst case scenario and make sure we cover everything off. We're meeting on a weekly basis, myself and officers, because I say it does move. On Monday morning, I have a telephone conference with the Secretary of State, Robert Jennick MP, at 11 o'clock. So I'm engaging with the government, officers are engaging with the government, we're engaging regionally and nationally with all the relevant bodies, and we are doing all we can. But some of this is a little bit second guessing. Some of the impact we've already seen, we have seen food inflation prices feeding through, and Sean alluded to it. One of the issues we have identified that may be a problem is if we see shortages of food, is how that will feed through into food banks, who rely on overcapacity in supermarkets for a lot of their stock in effect. So if supermarkets start to run out, that doesn't feed into food banks. So we've taken that into, we've done a lot of work around that, because these are the people who, even if prices stabilise, these are people who can't afford food now. With food inflation, that's going to make that situation worse. So we are working with all the food banks to check their resilience, as Sean alluded to. But it is very important, because these are the people at the bottom end of the ladder, and they're the ones that we must protect as best we can. We've got a website up and running, and it's pretty much in line with all the West Yorkshire local authorities. We've taken pretty much a joint approach. This is a signposting website, so signpost people to where they can get more accurate, up-to-date information, because you'd like to think the government could update their websites quicker than we can. So it's basically signposting, pointing people in the direction where they can get information. But that is now up and running. As I say, it's pretty much a standard across West Yorkshire. We've worked with other local authorities that we're all pretty much doing the right thing. As I say, it is a moving piece. It will constantly move. As I said, there's constant information coming in. But as I say, we are looking at this to make sure we're as prepared as possible. But there are things that could come from, if you like, left field that we don't spot. But we are trying to spot everything we can. And we'll constantly, as I say, continue to meet on a regular basis. We'll see what the government minister has to say on Monday, and we'll just continue to update information as much as we can as it becomes available.
Thank you, Chair. A comment and question on EU residence and settlement. We mentioned at the beginning about promoting settlement to EU citizens through a website. That was a piece of work that we were doing. I think more importantly, I think my major concern is on page 7 of 8 at the bottom, improving outcomes for children when we're talking about looked after children and care leavers. Now, these are some of the most vulnerable people in Kirklees that are under our direct care. Could you tell us a little bit more about the work that's happening on that and what we're actually doing?
There's a piece of work our education or our children's services are aware of that, and we totally endorse what you're saying. They're assessing the impacts and they're putting support mechanisms in place for people, for children that fall into that criteria. I haven't got any update other than that. It's on our radar, on our risk and assumptions radar, and they're following that through, but I haven't got an update on how many are impacted, that sort of information.
So no idea of scale or
no, I think from the conversations I've had when it were first discussed, it were a very few numbers. It's not big numbers.
Sure.
But it's a piece of work that children's services are picking up.
I'm sure you'll agree, small numbers but big impact potentially.
Absolutely,
on
yes.
these people's lives. So it's something that I think personally I'll be pursuing and seeing what that piece of work looks like. Thank you.
Yeah, one general comment and then a more specific one. This will tell you a lot about me. When I was at university, I set myself an assignment in which I read through every Labour and Liberal Democrat / SDP manifesto from the 60s onwards. And I remember upskilling domestic workers and and dealing with the productivity gap were mentioned in every single one of those, and haven't managed it since then in any of them. So that's described as an opportunity. It's slightly worrying for me because I know that we're not going to achieve it. So the skills and labour force issues are a worry. So more specifically with regard to that, the King's Fund research has said that about 28% of care homes are at pretty serious risk of financial failure, that the whole sector's quite vulnerable. And obviously the greatest cost for the social care sector is employment, their employees. They're more reliant as a sector than the majority of others on EU citizens, and a reduction in low-skilled migration that might follow Brexit is going to have a significant impact on them. And then, of course, us as a council. So as part of the Research Commission, could we also have a look at the potential workforce impacts, particularly for the social care sector, and then think about how that's going to affect us as a council, and potentially, if any homes are put at financial risk, the costs that we're going to have to incur to make sure that the provision's still there. Thank you.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go into too much into it, but I do agree with what Councillor Simpson just said there about the opportunities and risk section. When I read through that, I did raise a few eyebrows about, the pound reduces so we get more inward investment. Yeah, I think that's quite, to me anyway, personally, quite hopeful. And I think especially in the short term, and I think that's what we're looking at here, isn't it, about for a no-deal situation, what's going to be happening in the next few months and years to come. The only thing I just wanted to just touch on was there's a section at the end about the implications for the council, and one of them says working with partners, and there's a brief sort of summary about how obviously we'll need to work with partner areas. And I just wondered again, thinking about that very kind of, if we do get into a scenario where there is quite significant issues, and particularly with some of our vulnerable residents, etc., how we're going to be working with not just the ones you said around social services and food banks, etc., but that wider group of voluntary organisations, community organisations, and things that have their ear to the ground on what's happening. Because I think, like you say, food banks, for example, as you explained, that sounded like we were really thinking about how we could make sure they were still functioning. But there may be, as things transpire, do we need to look at a different approach to, for example, how we refer people to food banks? Because they won't necessarily be going through the usual process for referral if they're being impacted, if they're currently not don't need that support. But we have this greater impact because of food shortages, of food prices. So I just think it's how we do that, and I think that also links to the impact on the registration for EU nationals and so on. So I've not had any sort of issues raised with me directly, but I am quite conscious of this given the issues that have arisen over Windrush, and that's had impacted a lot of people in my ward. And I know there's some limits to our involvement in that, but I think we do need to sort of be mindful of it and be reactive to it if we do have people having issues with that, because it kind of has the potential to cause similar issues again, I think.
Some of your comments are, it's interesting because you're picking up some of the fluidity that we're trying to deal with all the time. And it's, we've tried to set ourselves up in a flexible, scalable approach so that we can adapt to different situations, information that's coming through. Certainly in voluntary organisations, on a West Yorkshire level, there's a subgroup. Without getting into too much detail, West Yorkshire Resilience Forum is a coordination, cooperation, information sharing forum. And as part of that planning cycle, there's different subgroups looking at different work streams. There's one that looks at voluntary orgs, that engages with voluntary orgs. More locally, we've got different mechanisms for engaging with voluntary organisations. So we are having them conversations and there are them links. And I think we're going to have to just be able to try and assess, anticipate what's going on, listen to what people are telling us, and adapt sort of our response to reflect what information we're getting through. But I agree totally what you're saying, and it's on our radar. And I'm not just saying that. It's emergency preparedness isn't black and white. We're often in that grey area, and we're trying to sort of like we adjust ourselves to what information we've got at the time. So we've got that we've got a structure that's working well, and it's adaptable enough to be able to sort of like move to whichever size it needs to move to plot our way through whatever risks and threats we've got to deal with.
Just coming back on Graham's comments, I'm sorry, this report has to be accurate because it's in the public domain. Now, we knew when this meeting was being held, we knew the date that was going on the report. It would have been better if instead of saying in the past week, they quoted dates. I'm just providing feedback, Graham. Similarly, on the Yellowhammer, it talks about many commentators. There are many commentators on the impact of no-deal Brexit, and then it lists some impacts. It doesn't say these are worst-case scenarios, so it doesn't give any context to that information. So somebody reading this independently could take that as being the council is saying these things are going to happen. So I'm not making any issues about, this is or isn't going to happen. I'm saying the report has to be accurate and it needs to be able to be read by an individual, not in this meeting, with no other context. And as it stands, it is misleading. That's the only thing I was saying on it.
Can I just ask you, John, given that what's been said about, the fact that agendas have to be provided in advance, the fact that things take a certain amount of, things are happening immediately, how would it be possible for a report such as this to be accurate in a way that would satisfy you? How would it be possible to do that within the council's procedures?
I don't understand what the problem is here. You're making a comment. I have no problem with you making a comment. You put a date in rather than last week. That's not difficult to do. If you're going to quote some information, you put context around that information that you're quoting, which is missing in this report. That's all I'm saying. It's not difficult.
It might perhaps be fair to have said which Sunday Times edition it was, whether it was which weekend it was. That's the only thing you could possibly have put in.
So Nathan has not spoken yet, so you are.
A very brief comment about the Yellowhammer part. I agree with the third bullet point where it makes more of a statement of fact. On the other bullet points, it's saying what could happen, whereas on the third bullet point, it says fresh food will become less available and prices will rise. And I think that could be misleading if somebody read it without further context saying it's a worst case scenario. All the other bullet points say things could happen. Whereas the third bullet point seems to suggest this is what's going to happen. I think it's really useful of Councillor Turner saying that they've launched a website. I'm just wondering what the plans are to inform residents and businesses about that. Recently, when I was visiting other parts of the country, there's bus signs out advertising how to prepare for Brexit and a no-deal Brexit, but I've not seen any of that in Kirklees.
Sorry, if I can just comment on, I agree with what you're saying. A date would have been useful so we could date stamp this comment. I think, I don't know if the Times article was before it went public, the Yellowhammer stuff, information, or it were a speculation or as on a reporter at that point. I can't just remember the timing, but I agree, if we'd have date stamped it, at least then we would have known the accuracy of the information from a press release to actually a government statement saying that these are the planning assumptions. So, yeah, point noted.
Yeah, So one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're trying to pull a document together or a briefing note for members, which will let them know where we are. But one of the problems with that is, of course, as soon as you write some of that, it's out of date. But we are trying to do that, and hopefully, I was speaking to the senior officer yesterday, that should be coming out in the next few days. So that'll give elected members the information of where we think we are, and it will be where we think we are, because obviously, as we keep all know, it changes. So there'll be a briefing note, and that will then allow elected members to be able to disseminate that information by website, etc., through the normal channels. It's always difficult, isn't it, because there's that much information at the moment coming from government channels as well. What we do may get lost, but as I said, first step, get a briefing note out of where we think we are for elected members, and then we'll move it on from there. We've only just literally got the web page up this last few days, in effect, so we will get that information out to people as best we can through normal channels, we'll use social media, etc.
Okay, so just summarising, we've provided input from here to the study that you're going to be conducting. So that will be of value. We've heard information about potential impacts. Nobody knows the future, and anybody who predicts the future more than a day ahead is a better man than I am. So there we go. We will see what occurs with that. Are there any things that you have taken from what you've heard that you'll be acting upon?
I mean, certainly the inputs for the additional information for the Commission I'm really grateful for that input, and as I say, it's timely that we were able to be here today, which is great news for me.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, I think that finishes Brexit. Next item, we'll move on to the Financial Management Update 1990-20. Over to Eamon.
Thank you, Chair. Just to briefly reintroduce myself, my name's Eamon Croston. I'm Service Director for Finance. So this is one of a series of reports that we normally bring to Corporate Scrutiny Panel through the year. This report is quite timely in a number of ways. It sets out how we're performing in terms of in-year financial management performance against the budgets that we were set, both on revenue and capital, accepting that it is still relatively early in the financial year, but I have appended at the back the more detailed financial monitoring report that was reported to Cabinet on 13th of August, just for reference. And the timeliness as well, in terms of we're about to present a budget strategy update report to Cabinet and Council, which we're still currently formulating, which sets out the financial planning framework for consideration of budget options to come forward. And that's going to be influenced in particular by the recent spending review announcement on 4th of September. So that's probably up for a bit of a discussion this morning as well. Again, I've appended to this report a briefing note that went out to councillors and staff internally, just to highlight what some of the key highlights that have come out of the spending review, and particularly from a point of view of what are the areas that we might consider that we would want to reflect on in terms of reviewing some of our baseline spend and funding in some assumptions, in light of the fact that the spending review has been announced so early on 4th September, which is these are, shall we say, different times, and there's a pretext why it's been announced so early in terms of getting some key government updates out of the way early to help councils and other public services plan ahead to allow for government departments to carry on preparations around Brexit. So that's kind of intelligence we wouldn't normally have at this time of year. So it does give us an opportunity to feed some of that into the budget strategy update report as well. Just briefly in terms of what's set out around in-year performance then. So I think the key message is that broadly against 287 million revenue budget, that as at quarter one we're predicting or forecasting a small overspend against that, which in relative terms is not a huge figure against 287 million pounds. I think this time last year we were predicting an equivalent figure of just under 5 million pounds, and by year end we brought that in line with budget. There are a number of things that are highlighted in the quarter one monitoring report around, shall we say, one-off factors that are impacting on the in-year position, and a number of factors that are probably more structural in nature. So certainly when we're looking at preparedness for the budget strategy update report, the usefulness of having that level of in-year intelligence means that there are some things that we do need to be mindful of in setting out our baseline assumptions. So some of what's set out in the quarter one monitoring report will undoubtedly feed into those baseline assumptions as well, where it makes sense and where it's appropriate. Just highlight as well that we have, for a number of years, certainly the last couple of years, highlighted locally some of the pressures against high needs provision, and that came through in setting our approved budget plan, and we've put quite a bit of detail into the quarter one monitoring report this time as well about some of the high needs pressures, particularly around national context, not just the local position. So we have hitherto put some provision into our medium-term financial plans to cover off some of those high needs pressures. But what we're forecasting in terms of the 1920 position around high needs is that there's likely to be around about a 4 million plus pressure that isn't factored into our plans. So what we set out as part of quarter one financial monitoring report is we're effectively going to transfer that pressure within allowable government guidelines and rules into the dedicated schools grant, which will effectively carry it forward on the balance sheet as a deficit against that grant. And what that will trigger, because the Department for Education says that if you're carrying forward a deficit as a council against that dedicated schools grant, if you're spending more than we've allocated out, that's available, if it's more than 1% of the overall sum of schools grant that's available to the council in year, which I think for us is over 300 million, then that triggers a recovery plan that will be presented to the Department for Education. But I think the reason that we're doing that is we think that actually we don't necessarily think it's sustainable to have that level of unfunded pressure to continue to be offset against the general fund, at least in the short term, while we've got other potential pressures. But it does also send a signal back to the Department for Education, because we're not the only council in this position. I think current national intelligence suggests that there's quite a number of councils and an increasing number of councils, I think 1 in 4 carrying a deficit position, but an increasing numbers carrying a significant deficit against their dedicated schools grant. And that's only going to increase, I think, over time because of the scale of pressures on high needs provision. There's been concerted national lobbying, and it's interesting to note from the Spending Review 2019 that there is a significant government announcement around additional funding into that sector. So I think government's clearly listening to some of these pressure areas, and 700 million is quite a significant increase nationally. Our estimated share of that, I've got to be careful here because the devil's in the detail with some of these government announcements, but it could be anywhere between 4 and 5 million pounds more than we were anticipating this time, certainly when we approved last year's budgets. And that's just for 2021. We don't know yet what's going to happen in terms of future years as well. So while we're doing this, we think it's actually the right thing to do at this point in time until we get an understanding of the longer term funding position for councils. So one way of looking at it is transferring that pressure onto the balance sheet, roll it forward, and if the government announcement is an extra 5 million funding next year, that could be used to offset some of this pressure. It doesn't necessarily deal with some of the underlying pressures that will carry forward into future years, but we need to understand what the longer term horizon is in terms of high needs pressures going forward. So I think it's a good start that central government is recognising some of these pressures in the system. Again, that's early intelligence to inform the spending round for 2019. I've also put in the summary paper at the front as well that I would expect and anticipate by year end that 2 million overspend that we were referring to, and it is an expectation for portfolio holders that we will come in online at year end. So that's my clear expectation, because if we don't, effectively that will be an overall deficit on the bottom line, which will be a hit against our financial resilience reserves, which we want to hold in light of all the myriad pressures that councils like ourselves are going to be facing potentially. So I think that's a clear imperative, I think, but I am pretty confident that we will get there by year end. We are usually quite prudent at quarter one, but what we have certainly done for the last few years is get all the stuff out earlier rather than later, and we'll continue to work with services around that. Just very briefly, in terms of preparations for budget strategy update, what I've set out here in the covering report, which is sort of page 17 of the main pack, is just some key highlights of things that we would expect to consider in terms of formulating our starting point or baseline position or financial framework, as it were. So it takes into account what our existing plans are. We'll have a look at delivery against savings, what our in-year performance is telling us, any appropriate national, regional, local intelligence to inform that, key emerging strategies and plans, and obviously in terms of political priorities for any subsequent proposals that will come forward. So obviously give colleagues an opportunity to comment whether we've got the right things in there. Have we missed anything at this stage? The only other thing I would say is that there'll be further opportunity, I think certainly through November's corporate scrutiny panel, for further reflection in terms of some of the core assumptions that will figure as part of the budget strategy update report, because while it's a starting point, we've still got opportunity to flex, challenge or change some of those assumptions as we shape the plans to the back end of the year, to the point where we approve our budgets as well. So there will be further opportunity.
Okay, we've had an hour and a half training, so we're all experts now on financial planning. I'll take Councillor Turner first, because I know you've got to go.
Yeah, I've got to go in a minute. So just a very quick one. I'm pleased to see, in terms of the capital plan, that you're predicting a much closer alignment with the forecast this year. But it does then go on to make a comment that later in the year you will be reprofiling future years. Can I just ask that we're looking to do that in a timely way, so that as we go through the budget preparation, the capital plan that is considered in the budget preparation is reflective of that replanning? Is that likely?
Yes. I think. Yeah.
Okay. Next, who's itching to make a comment? Councillor Homewood.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one, really, about the budget strategy. I just wanted to check we've talked obviously a lot already about the volatility in the situation at the moment with Brexit. So I just wanted to check about how potential government budget is going to impact this, because I know they've done the spending review, and then there's a lot of discussion at the moment about when actually the budget will be, because there's a potential for a general election and so on. And I noted that someone reported that they're expecting maybe that the government bring forward a budget quite soon when Parliament comes back. But then other people have said that's actually not legal because it'd be too close to a potential election and so on. So I'm just wondering what happens if actually that gets pushed out into December or January, or I'm not sure what the legal requirements are about when a budget has to be passed in Parliament, and then what implications that would have on us, because I know that certainly since they've moved the budget to this time of year, I know there has been some issues, I think, generally around how that then budget engagement process happens with councils and things, because we've not got a clear answer to the question around what the settlement actually is for us. And I know that caused problems in the past couple of years. So I just wondered what implications there might be and what you're thinking about that.
Okay, thank you for that question. That is a really good and pertinent question, actually. And because what I suppose what it does raise is that on the one hand, I'm saying, great, we've got an early spending review announcement. And then obviously we acknowledge that nationally there could be a general election. We don't know when that might happen. We've discussed in the early report about the various potential scenarios and short, medium and longer term implications around Brexit. And we know in terms of our corporate risk, the Council's corporate risk register, which we attach to our budget plans and will be attached as part of the budget strategy update report. Even putting Brexit issues to one side, there are a number of other risks and pressures and areas of concern that are already highlighted on our corporate risk register as it is. And clearly one of the impacts of Brexit is they'll act as a lever probably to accelerate some of those pressures that are already on there. I think from an officer's perspective, notwithstanding the potential sort of national hiatus and machinations of how that will pan out, the fact that we have had a spending review, we haven't, in some respects, a kind of high-level announcements, like £1.5 billion for social care, multi-billions for education system, including the 700 million for high needs and the 400 million for further education sector and other announcements as well. Even at this stage, I think we can make a reasonable stab at what that may mean in terms of likely indicative allocations for Kirklees Council, because we know that their intended method of distributing that funding is probably consistent with previous allocation methods where we can reasonably calculate what our share is going to be. But the broader question, of course, is, well, how do we know that that's actually all going to wash through anyway? And if we do have a general election and a different configuration of government nationally, are all the balls up in the air again and we're starting from square one? I think there is an element of risk attached to certainty, but I think as a baseline, it's not unreasonable for officers to expect that regardless of what happens subsequently, at least for 2021, those broad baseline issues will wash through, because in the key areas, when you look at police, health, education and others, to some extent, those are areas where there's already been a lot of national lobbying about the fact that these areas are potentially underfunded and have been for some time. So I wouldn't expect any government of any complexion going forward not to honour most of those issues, at least in terms of getting it through Parliament, because you're absolutely right. At the back end of the process, there is a whole legislative framework that means that councils have to set their precepts by a certain date, get the bills out by a certain date, approve the balanced budget through the democratic process, and those dates are non-negotiable. So we're reasonably confident, or absolutely confident, that government or whatever Parliament will need to make sure that the relevant bills are passed to enable those processes to work at a local level. I would say that's absolutely non-negotiable. It's got to happen. It's just working out through the UK Parliament what mechanisms they will employ to ensure that it's pushed through in a timely fashion. I don't know if that kind of answers some of your concerns, but...
Okay. Will, you're next, and we are going to be coming back to this, so we could if we be brief.
Thank you, Chair. Eamon, could you just explain the recovery plan a bit more to me? So that'll be triggered because of the amount of money that's been transferred. Do they then seek to recover that from future education grant funded, or from general fund, or from where can we expect them to try and recover it from in future?
Okay, so the rationale for the recovery plan, that recovery plan's been there for a number of years. It used to be 0.5%, but I think last year government increased it to 1% in terms of the trigger, and that, at the time, that was in light of, I think, the Department for Education were getting increasingly concerned about some of the funding pressures and the fact that more and more councils seemed to be in a position where they were having to potentially fund increasing pressures on high needs through general fund rather than through the dedicated schools grant. So they wanted to tighten their rules a little bit, or tighten their rules a little bit. Sorry. So the purpose of the recovery plan is it's basically set over a 3-year period, and it's really down to councils to determine how they go about closing that gap within the totality of their local circumstance, how they're going to approach in terms of reviewing some of their operational practice, maybe putting more funding into some aspects of general fund services that can actually support and deliver better outcomes for pupils that have special educational needs and education, health and care plans, and also about working with the school sector, broader conversations with the school sector as well. So I think there's an amalgam of different approaches. We've also put some significant investment into our forward capital plans around promoting district sufficiency, particularly where otherwise some of those pupils will be placed out of area and are more expensive. But that's kind of medium to long term. So I think there's a number of measures that we can employ to bring, or to attempt to bring, that recovery plan down to the point where we're not continuing to carry forward or even grow those deficits. But I think it's fair to say from a broader sector perspective, it is predicated on sufficient funding of high needs and national funding recognition of that, which is why I say the 700 million that government have announced for next year is welcome, but we're not quite sure beyond next year what's going to happen beyond in terms of years 2 and 3. But if they were to put a significant amount in for years 2 or 3, then that would go a long way to reducing that, I suppose, deficit build-up. So that's probably as far as I can say at this moment in time. But I do know that the service as well and a broader council in the sector are pulling together a pretty robust set of actions as part of that planning to have a look and see where they can actually bring it back in. But fundamentally about not just in terms of the money, but it's really about how we position the way that we deliver those services to that category, that cohort of pupils, and can we get better outcomes for those pupils as part of that process? That's putting the kids at the heart of this.
Okay, Councillor Lawson wants to make a quick point, and then Mr. Chalmers.
Thank you, Chair. I'm talking about the adult social care help announced in the spending review, and 500 million will be raised through 2% council tax precept. I'm going to put you on the spot here, sorry, Eamon, but do you have an idea of how much that will raise locally in Kirklees, and how much that extra burden would be on a, say, Band D property? I mean, if you haven't, maybe that's something that you can bring back later, but it's interesting to know.
Yeah, to be honest, it's something we'll factor into the budget strategy update report as well in terms of an illustrative guide. In terms of what would a 2% precept look like in broad terms, it would be just under £4 million, about £3.7 million
okay.
In terms of a local impact.
Yeah, in terms of the medium-term plan, when you've built in inflation costs, have that been at the sort of the target that the Bank of England has? And would you have to do a sort of a broad basis on a higher rate that might be indicated post-Brexit?
Good question. Again, it goes back to what is a reasonable set of assumptions at a point in time, and trying to sort of preempt and predict what scenarios there may be post-Brexit. So certainly now, so looking at inflation, because that's inflation impacts in a number of different areas. So we've got inflationary assumptions around direct staff pay award, which I think in our existing plans is assumed at 2% for 2021, which is a starting point. We factor in inflation into contracted services, particularly adult social care, but children's, because as I'm sure you'll appreciate, one of the impacts of the national living wage uplift is that puts cost pressure on contracted services as well, because they employ a lot of lower paid staff. So we do actually reflect that in terms of our uplifts to contractors. In terms of other cost inflation, I think over the last 4 years, in terms of, I suppose, the council's own efficiency drive to support some of the to counter some of the impact of austerity measures. I suppose in a number of areas, we've actually budgeted cash limit budgets other than those key demand areas, and that's part of our, I suppose, overall imperative to actually manage or contain our procurement within existing budgets, but get better value for money. So when we're looking at, there's been a number of corporate scrutiny panels more recently looking at our procurement procedures and what we're doing around procurement. So some of the assumptions are based around efficiencies. So we might actually acknowledge that there's going to be general inflationary pressure, but actually we think that through better procurement and delivering better value for money, some of that can be contained. I think undoubtedly one of the key areas of concern is around adult social care more generally, and that's actually a concern that's laid out in our corporate risk register as it is, because it kind of varies by region and also in terms of local, if we compare ourselves with other councils, in terms of capacity in the market. So that's already a pressure for Kirklees, particularly in the home care market, but I think across the whole sector as well. So there could be some short-term impacts around cost inflation in those areas, as catering in terms of schools provision, etc. Our financial strategies involved, particularly over the last couple of budget rounds, a measured build-up of financial resilience reserves as part of our overall resilience as a council, so that if there are going to be any short-term impacts, that's potentially an area to go while we consider the kind of the medium and longer term. So our financial reserve strategy kind of acknowledges explicitly as well as implicitly that if there are any short-term pressures, and we feel mindful to release some of those while we work out longer term, then there are, at least financially, notwithstanding the logistics of what might happen operationally, there are some things that we can do in terms of drawing down temporary funding to mitigate some of those short-term impacts. But I think, as been stated from the outset, it's incredibly difficult to predict where it's like, I don't know, squeezing a balloon, you squeeze it in one area, it pops up somewhere else, other than acknowledging that there's a whole range of potential impacts. And I think we've got a fairly measured approach that's not going to destabilise the organisation in terms of the clear rationale why we've built up some of those reserves.
In terms of the current budget, we would be in a better position to predict things once you get to the reporting from Q2, I guess.
In terms of it being after October 31st.
You're already 2 million adrift, aren't you, in your predictions?
Yeah. Certainly in terms of in-year predictions, as you get further in the year, obviously you get, I suppose, more confidence in terms of costs and income that we've received through the year in terms of forecasts towards the back end of the year. So I'm still pretty confident that we will close that gap and get to kind of a break-even position by year end.
Okay. Any further comments before we close this? All right. Okay.
Very, very brief. I'm just trying to understand one part, which is around car parking charges.
Yeah.
Where there's quite a big shortfall, and it works out at about 30% down. And what the comment in the report says that car parking charges are frozen and have been for a number of years, and that means that the income targets can't be achieved, but we're agreed in the budget. I'm just wondering, because it sounds like you know in advance that it's unachievable, why would it be put in the budget when it's unachievable? Thanks.
That is a really good point. Yes, in a word. Car parking charges have been frozen. It's one of these discretionary areas, and I think we know generally that it's quite a contentious area for a number of reasons, and particularly more latterly in the context of some of the key emerging strategies, things like I'm not just talking about climate emergency, but also about some of the major regeneration initiatives around our towns and cities. And it's obviously an issue with residents and businesses as well. But I think certainly in terms of what I said earlier, if there are some key structural issues in terms of our current year monitoring, then we need to address those in terms of a baseline reassessment of part of our budget strategy update report. And I think that's one of those areas that I would expect us to be looking at, that we would see as part of our forthcoming update report.
Okay, the work programme is on there for information, and just a reminder of what we had last time. And that wraps up the meeting. Thank you very much.